Before we get into the main theme of this lecture, I'd like to include a postscript to the former one. The decipherment of Linear B, which I mentioned last time, is too fascinating to let slip by. It begins with Sir Arthur Evans excavating on Crete. His work there revealed Minoan civilization for the first time. But beyond the remarkable scale and wealth displayed by the Palace of Knossos, seen in its former glory in this reconstruction drawing, he also found two previously unknown forms of writing. He called them Linear A and B. His fame in showing the world a lost civilization was tinged with personal frustration, though. He could not decipher those scripts. Enter Michael Ventris. Blessed with a gift for languages, he mastered French, German, Polish, Latin, Greek, Russian, Swedish, and more. Then, at age 14, he heard the 85-year-old Evans speak, and he became obsessed with the challenge of deciphering Linear B. Lacking professional credentials, he was, of course, ignored, even as he wrote to scholars about his progress. But then he caught the attention of the classical scholar John Chadwick, who had been one of the legendary Bletchley Park code breakers of World War II, they who unlocked the Nazis' Enigma code system. Ventris and Chadwick became collaborators on Linear B. Their task was daunting. Most linguists believed that deciphering an unknown language in an unknown writing system was simply impossible. Ventris had guessed it might be Etruscan, but that proved a dead end. He and Chadwick agreed that it must be a syllabary, since it had 87 symbols, too few for ideograms, and too many for an alphabet. Alice Kober, another classicist, noted that what appeared to be the same word in the text had different symbols at the end. Therefore, it was an inflected language, like Greek or Latin. Then, more tablets in Linear B turned up at Pylos on the Greek mainland. The researchers found that there were a few words on the Cretan tablets that didn't appear on the Pylos ones, and this led to an inspired guess. Might these be Cretan place names? And this, in turn, gave them their first breakthrough when they found the word Knossos. And at last, they could establish that Linear B was actually an early form of Greek. So that was all it took to decipher Linear B. 4 brilliant scholars, painstaking research, and some lucky guesses. And now, on with our series. Thanks are due once again to David Ewart for his book, A General Introduction to the Bible, From Ancient Tablets to Modern Translations, and to its publisher, Zondervan, for permission to draw from it. After completing the preliminaries, such as the languages of the Bible and the mechanics and process of composing them, we come today to the formation of the Old Testament canon. Who wrote these books, and how did they come to be a part of our Bible? And first, just what is a canon? Although it sounds like this, the canon in question has only 2 ends, not 3, and it refers to a standard of some kind. The Hebrew word is kaneh, which means a stalk or a reed. It occurs in statements like this: "And the Lord will strike Israel, so that it will be like a reed swaying in the water. That's 1 Kings 14:15. The corresponding Greek word is kanon, which often has the connotation of a rule or standard, as in Galatians 6:16. Peace and mercy to all who follow this rule, even to the Israel of God. And we have probably heard reference to someone being canonized. Here's a dictionary definition of that: the act by which a particular Christian church declares a deceased person to be a saint and is included in the canon or list of recognized saints. And then we get the adjective canonical, meaning a part of the canon, that is, one of the books comprising a biblical canon, as opposed to apocryphal or spurious books. And from there, the usage can spread to more or less trivial items, like this item I found for sale. It's a Sherlock Holmes mug. The mug shows the name of each of the 60 canonical cases, rendered in 4 canonically relevant colors, and a dozen different typefaces. Well, I'm sure we can see which of these usages is appropriate here. Here, then, are the books of the Old Testament. As for their authors, we have a combination of solid evidence, clues, and oral traditions. For the Pentateuch, Christians should have confidence that the author was Moses. Jesus, after all, said to the Pharisees, "For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" John 5:46 and 7. Not much question there. But of course, Genesis tells us events from well before Moses' birth: the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the flood of Noah, and all the way back to creation itself. What was his source for all of that? There may be a clue in the fact that Genesis has 10 segments, marked by a phrase like, "This is the account or record of." Here is a comment worth considering. Generations is a translation of the Hebrew word toledoth, which means origin or record of the origin. It identifies an account or record of events. The phrase was apparently used at the end of each section in Genesis, identifying the patriarch, Adam, Noah, sons of Noah, Shem, and so forth, to whom it primarily referred, and possibly who was responsible for the record. There are 10 such divisions in Genesis. Each record was probably originally a stone or clay tablet. This from Don Batten in the article Genesis Contradictions, Creation Magazine, Volume 18, 44 through 45. Now Jesus attributed the Pentateuch to Moses, but note this brief portion at the end of Deuteronomy. "And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day no one knows where his grave is." Deuteronomy 34, 5 and 6. This was obviously added later, perhaps by Joshua. The book of Joshua would have been written by its chief character, as the book itself tells us, in Joshua 24:26, that Joshua, quote, "wrote these words." Rabbinic tradition credits Judges, Ruth, and 1 and 2 Samuel to Samuel, and he did indeed have both the prophetic gift and the reputation to justify that. And 1 Samuel 10:25 tells us how Samuel wrote them in a book and laid it up before the Lord. But we should be cautious about 2 Samuel. Remember this passage? Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. 1 Samuel 25:1. And as you know, 2 Samuel records almost all the reign of King David, which was, of course, after Samuel's death. 1 and 2 Kings is, for all we can see, anonymous, but its contents run down to about the 6th century B.C., so it would perhaps have been completed then. Much the same is true for 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They too are anonymous, but perhaps drawn from records of the royal family which we know did exist. The account extends to the 5th century B.C. For Ezra, we have some evidence to justify crediting it to Ezra the priest and scribe. Some of the book is in the first person, as we read here. Praise be to the Lord, the God of our fathers, who has put it into the king's heart to bring honor to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem in this way, and who has extended his good favor to me before the king and his advisers and all the king's powerful officials. Because the hand of the Lord my God was on me, I took courage and gathered leading men from Israel to go up with me. That's Ezra 7:27-28. The book of Nehemiah, with its account of the rebuilding of Jerusalem's wall, is obviously a first-person narrative from Nehemiah himself. We cannot be sure about the book of Esther, with its dramatic account of her courage in saving her people from annihilation. Jewish tradition says that her uncle Mordecai may have written it, but no one knows. The book of Job stands alone as apparently coming from the patriarchal period. Who wrote it, one can't say, although there is a rabbinic tradition that it may have been composed by Moses. Then we come to the non-historical books. We all know that the Psalms are mostly credited to David, although Asaph's name appears on perhaps a dozen of them. One normally thinks of Solomon in connection with the Proverbs, especially since 1 Kings 4:32 attributes 3,000 of them to him. And the recording must have continued long after his death. Quote, "These are more proverbs of Solomon, copied by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah." Proverbs 25:1. But there were others, including King Lemuel. Proverbs 31 is stated to be his, or rather, his mother's. The book of Ecclesiastes, with its deep musings on the nature of life, was written by a son of David, presumably Solomon, though that phrase could apply to any of David's descendants. Then there is the Song of Songs, often called Song of Solomon, and its opening sentence tells us that it is his. As for the remaining books of the Old Testament, the specifically prophetic books, all of them provide us with the names of their authors, down to the last, Malachi. Considering this sweep of history some 1,000 years, David Ewart observes, apparently, by the 5th century B.C., all the books of the Old Testament had been written. The question now is, what happened to these books once they were published? Once they were written, we would like to know where and how these books were kept. And there the clues all seem to suggest that they were kept in the sanctuary. Moses had completed the Torah, and the end of Deuteronomy tells us what happened to it. After Moses finished writing in a book the words of this law from beginning to end, he gave this command to the Levites, who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. Take this book of the law and place it beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God. There it will remain as a witness against you. Deuteronomy 31, 24-26. Joshua apparently followed this same protocol when the book bearing his name was finished. Quote, "And Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. Then he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak near the holy place of the Lord." Joshua 24:26. Through the years, authors like Samuel honored this tradition, because we read, quote, "Then Samuel told the people the rights and duties of the kingship, and he wrote them in a book and laid it up before the Lord." 1 Samuel 10:25. And there the sacred books must have remained. We find what happened in the days of Josiah the king, when he was presiding over a period of revival. Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the secretary, "I have found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord." He gave it to Shaphan, who read it. Then Shaphan the secretary informed the king, "Hilkiah the priest has given me a book." And Shaphan read from it in the presence of the king. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his robes. 2 Kings 22:8-11. What references we have to these books indicate that, apart from the times of neglect, they were universally respected. Daniel's attitude during the exile in Babylon is a model, since Daniel 9:2 tells us, "In the first year of his reign," that is, the reign of Darius of Persia, "I, Daniel, understood from the Scriptures, according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. Daniel 9:2. That passage is, by the way, the first occasion when the term Scriptures is used to reference these works. We may also notice the great gathering that Ezra called together of those who had returned from Babylonian exile. On the second day of the month, the heads of all the families, along with the priests and the Levites, gathered round Ezra the scribe to give attention to the words of the law. They found written in the law, which the Lord had commanded through Moses, that the Israelites were to live in booths during the feast of the 7th month. The whole company that had returned from exile built booths and lived in them. From the days of Joshua, son of Nun, until that day, the Israelites had not celebrated it like this, and their joy was very great. Nehemiah 8:13-14 and 17. On the authority of the Scripture, then, they reinstituted the Feast of Tabernacles. So then the books were respected, but who actually established them as canonical? There's no specific historical record of that, but there is a significant clue. It appears in 2 Maccabees, written about 165 BC. Quote, "The same things also were reported in the writings and commentaries of Nehemiah, and how he, founding a library, gathered together the Acts of the Kings and the Prophets, and of David, and the epistles of the kings concerning the holy gifts." That's 2 Maccabees 2:13. As you know, Ezra and Nehemiah were contemporaries, and both deeply concerned to restore the people of Israel to the worship of the Lord and reverence for his word. So, the reference to Nehemiah here, doing what sounds very much like collecting all the Old Testament books, suggests his involvement in the creation of the canon. And then there is the bizarre tale about Ezra that we find in 2nd Esdras, chapter 14. This is one of the apocryphal books written around the 1st century A.D. It tells us that through some catastrophe, all of what we call the Old Testament was lost in the time of Ezra. God called him to restore it. He spent 40 days dictating to a platoon of scribes, leaving them finally with 94 books. But he was instructed to release just 24 of them for the people, while keeping the other 70 to be accessible only to the wise. Stripped of its unlikely or impossible elements, this odd story at least suggests a connection between Ezra and the actual 24 book of the entire Old Testament. We know, of course, from other testimony like that of Josephus, that the Jews considered their sacred canon to consist of 24 books. But were there other books of any kind? And indeed, there were. The Bible itself tells us that there were, like the book of Jashar. Joshua 10:13-14, in the passage that recounts the sun standing still, references that book. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jashar. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky, and delayed going down about a full day. There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a man. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. We also know of a book called the Book of the Wars of the Lord, from a reference in Numbers. The Arnon is the border of Moab, between Moab and the Amorites. That is why the Book of the Wars of the Lord says, Waheb, in Suphah, and the ravines, the Arnon and the slopes of the ravines that lead to the site of Ar, and lie along the border of Moab. Numbers 21:13-15. And in Chronicles we find a mention of the annals of the kings of Israel, something that sounds like an official state record. The other events of Manasseh's reign, including his prayer to his God and the words of the seers spoken to him in the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, are written in the annals of the kings of Israel. 2 Chronicles 33:18. But that work has apparently not survived. There were certainly other books, but the Jews did not consider them to be canonical. Still, there is another way to look at this issue. Were there questions about the books that were included in the Old Testament canon? Scholars are fond of pointing out that there was a council of rabbis held at Jamnia in A.D. 90. This was after the destruction of the Temple and of Jerusalem, and there would naturally have been deep fears for the integrity of Judaism itself and its sacred books. We know that the council did raise questions about some of the books we find in our Bibles, and we can perhaps see why. For example, Jonah. Given what pagan nations had done to Israel over the centuries, we can well imagine that some rabbis would be uncomfortable to read in Jonah that God would send the prophet to godless Assyria to call them to repentance. Would God really care about that hated empire? Some questioned Ezekiel. Not only was the prophet difficult to understand, but his visions were filled with images of animals, and God had warned against the making of images, had he not? And the discussions touched on Proverbs, or at least on a few of them. For example, do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be like him yourself. That instruction is immediately followed by, "Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes." Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. Wasn't that contradictory? Another book mentioned in the deliberations was Esther. Though inspiring and supportive of national fervor, it provides the basis for the feast of Purim, one that the law of Moses does not mention. And worse still, the name of God never appears in it anywhere. Some, too, wondered about Ecclesiastes. Does it really suggest that everything is without meaning? And then finally there were doubts about the Song of Songs. It seemed to some to be a bit too sexually explicit for inclusion in the sacred canon. And yet we should be careful not to misunderstand the purpose and nature of the council at Jamnia. David Ewart places it in context for us. Quote, "It would be overstating the case if we said that this council fixed the limits of the Hebrew canon. But it raised questions about the presence of certain books in the canon. Books that the council refused to admit to the canon had not been there in the first place. The primary concern of the council was the right of certain books to remain in the canon, not the acceptance of new books." With all of this background, there remains one question. Was the Old Testament really finished? And we can say the evidence suggests that the Jews did indeed consider it completed. One strong indication of that fact is that around 250 BC, they set about to have their sacred books translated into Greek. With many of their own people living outside Israel in a Greek-speaking world, it seemed the sensible thing to do. Just a little more than a century had passed since Malachi, and yet they had no qualms about treating their Bible as complete and ripe for dissemination to the world. And those of us who trust the authority of Jesus above all others can point to his treatment of the Old Testament. After his resurrection, he reproved the disciples for not seeing that his life, death, and resurrection were prophesied. He said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Luke 24:44. That threefold division of law, prophets, and Psalms is exactly what the Jews recognized as their sacred canon. And there's another statement of Jesus that is relevant here. In a scathing denunciation of the unbelief and disobedience he saw around him, he said, "Therefore this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, this generation will be held responsible for it all." Luke 11:50 and 51. In speaking of Abel, son of Adam, he referenced the earliest sentences of Genesis. And as for Zechariah, his murder is the last murder of a prophet mentioned in 2 Chronicles, which is the last historical book of the Old Testament. Thus, it is as if Jesus had said, from Genesis to Malachi, he placed his imprimatur on the Old Testament canon. If you have questions about this lecture, or any of the others in this series, you may address them to me, Dr. Jerry C. Four, at yahoo.com.